If you've seen the first two king and pawn endgame videos, then you know that there's a lot to learn about them. And I'm not going to promise you that this video is going to cover everything else. I've already made a lot of videos about king and pawn endgames, opposition, and different things like that. So make sure you're watching all of those, and there's more to come. But this one is going to try to cover some important ideas. I'm going to talk about bait pawns. I'm going to talk about rook pawns. I'm going to talk about moving your king in a diagonal pattern on your way towards your destination. Then we're going to talk about when you have two passed pawns against the king and how it works differently in each one of these circumstances. And then we'll talk about triangulation and a golden square deflection technique. So a lot to talk about. I'm going to go pretty quickly, so let's get going. All right, first of all, the bait pawn. We have this passed A pawn, but it's a rook pawn, and that means it can't promote. Let's have a look at that right from the start. So if we play A4, it's a draw. Already, black can get a draw. They just stay in front of our pawn, and as we advance it up the board, they keep their king in front. And notice now if you play king A6, after they move their king in the corner, you play king A6, then it's a stalemate. And if you abandon it and start running to the other side, now that's going to give their king plenty of time to get in front of your other rook pawn that now will create the stalemate. So instead, at the very beginning, we want to make sure that our bait pawn, that first pass pawn we create, the pawn on A2 in this case, that we leave it back and make their king spend 3 moves to capture that pawn, not 1 or 2 moves. Every move is critical. And we immediately take off and go for the other side of the board. So we run over here, take there. As we step out of the way, we think about blocking our opponent's king off, making sure he can't get in front of the pawn. Then and only then do we start pushing that pawn forward and promote it. Now, with the rook pawn, we want to look first, can we just advance it and win? But if you see now, if we advance the pawn, the square of the pawn is going to move like this, and the black king can move into the square and catch your pawn. That's how you know you have to first shield your pawn with your king. So your king will move up, keep your opponent's king away, and then you can start advancing it like we did in the previous example. Now, when can you catch your opponent's pawn? When do you know that you will be able to get the draw? Here, white's trying to get the draw. If your king can make it to the square where your bishop started before their pawn has made it down to promote, you're in good shape. Here we see that we can make it that way. And even though black keeps us from getting in front of the pawn, we're going to trap the black king there. And black will have a choice to either move out of the way like this, and then we get in front for the stalemate, or they'll keep their king in front of the pawn, and it's actually black who's stalemated, even though they have the extra pawn. Now, with rook pawns, there's a lot of different ways that you may have to move it exactly to the right square. Here, the white king guards all those critical squares, so the black king can't come running back. And of course, if he approaches the pawn right now, then the pawn just moves up 2 squares and escapes him. In this example, we're trying to get the draw again. And remember, we're either going to go after the pawn, or we're going to go towards F2 to trap the black king in front of it. So those are our different options that we have. So we can come in and aim towards both of those destinations. And once again, if the black king tries to keep us out of F2, then we can capture the pawn. And if they push the pawn, then we're back to that same situation as before. Here, we have to take an extra step. We get out of the way first and get to the golden square, really shield them off before we start pushing that pawn up. And now in this example, we need to get a draw. The black king is 2 moves away from taking our pawn, and he'll be in front of the pawn, and so he'll be able to get the opposition against our king, even if he has to waste a move. So instead, we jettison the pawn and turn the black pawn into a rook pawn. If they ignore it, we just can come back and get in front of the pawn and get the draw that way. But if they capture the pawn, we just get our king into the square. He'll be able to get in front of the rook pawn and save the day, get the draw. Okay, so now we have our rook pawn. We need to capture here, but if we come straight across and take it, the black king is going to do something along these lines and then come into this square and trap us in front of our own pawn. So we see that coming and we slow him down by moving to B7 in a little triangle pattern like this. And that slowed down the black king just enough to be able to win the game. Same thing defensively. With black trying it, we are going to move our king. Watch this. Instead of coming straight down where we get blocked off, we're going to play king D7 and follow in behind. Look at this path that our king takes from C8 to C2. He goes all the way out to F5 and comes back. It takes the exact same amount of moves, but this time we don't get slowed down by the black king. And you trail behind and get the draw that way. Okay, so now when you have two passed pawns against a king, there's several different plans that you need to use. This one is simply called split passers. And those pawns guard themselves, because as soon as the king goes towards one of them, you push the other. And notice all these squares are off limits. The king can't come here or here, and then he can't go to the rank below your more advanced passed pawn, because then it just takes off and promotes. And so there's like this whole boot of protection. And the king is going to have to go all the way around this little boot and try to come around the backside. When he gets to the top of the boot, though, we're going to level the pawns off again. And not before that. Don't push those pawns again until that king gets all the way up there, or if he goes below your pawns. So now we can move and capture here. Oh, wait, he made it to the top of the boot. We have to level the pawns off. He goes after one, and we push the other, and now we capture. By the way, it's not over. You have to always be careful and look to see what your opponent's trying to do. Here, if you promote to a queen, stalemate. So don't ever relax in a game of chess until your opponent says I resign or you say checkmate. So now king here, queen, and a nice little finish. The queen forces the mate in two there. Now, these pawns are split a little further apart. Do they need help from the king? And the answer is no. The reason we know that is if you count how many squares until you promote, and the same sideways. If your other passed pawn is inside the square of your pawn, then you don't have to worry about bringing the king over. So these pawns are 3 steps away, and they're 3 squares apart also. The white king isn't needed. You push one, push the other, push one, push the other, and promote that way. But here, it's 4 steps, and this one is in the square, but too much in the square. He needs to be on the edge of the square, or further. Here, in this case, we're going to need help from the king. If you push one pawn, he gets to take both of them. And that didn't work out very well. So when they are too close, then you're going to have to bring your king over to help and easily promote from here. Now in this case, your opponent has a pawn, and we can move our king into the square, but then they get to capture both our pawns. Their king will capture one, then come running over and take the other. Fortunately, you can promote with check and another check. So always keep that in mind. One move before black was able to promote with check, by the way. Okay, triangulation. Triangulation is a simple idea of getting to a square that's 1 square away and getting there in 2 moves instead of 1 move. And so if you go right now to f5, black plays king d4, you're in Zugzwang. You have to move away from guarding your pawn, and you will lose. But if you get to f5 in 2 moves, and the first move has to be forcing, if you go king to f6, attacking that pawn, they have to come in and defend, and then same exact position, now it's black's turn. Now this one's very often done incorrectly. When white just moves straight up and black plays here, it's a draw. White has to move away from guarding that front pawn. The black king is in front of the only passed pawn that remains. So instead you triangulate. The king goes over here and then to the square. And now with double pawns, always remember push the first pawn with reckless abandon until the move before stalemate. And then waste a move with the other pawn, and then squeeze him out. Get your king to the golden square after he's moved out of the way. And finally, a nice deflection trick in order to win this game. So our opponent has the split passers. If we come back here, it's just going to be a draw. Both kings are just going to have to sit and defend against a pawn. But white has a clever maneuver here. Check it out. Oh, yes. You promote to deflect the king from the golden square, and now check, check, and checkmate. All right, really advanced stuff in this challenge level king and pawn endgame. Keep watching for these. Watch the other ones. Watch them over and over again. And make sure to subscribe. I'll check you later.